It was the night of June 5th, 1944, over the storm-filled skies of northern France. Searchlights cut through the clouds, tracer rounds arched upward, and anti-aircraft bursts lit the darkness like firecrackers from hell. Below, villages trembled as church bells rang amid confusion. German sentries shouted orders into the wind, their rifles raised toward the descending shadows. Hundreds of parachutes dotted the sky. An invasion, they thought, had begun. But many of those figures drifting down through the chaos weren't men at all. They were made of cloth, straw, and rope dummy paratroopers, carefully designed illusions falling into the heart of occupied Europe. In those frantic minutes, radio networks exploded with conflicting reports. German commanders redirected entire reserve units toward phantom drops, while real Allied forces prepared to land miles away on the beaches of Normandy. What looked like soldiers were, in truth, weapons of deception, part of a vast psychological war waged in silence and darkness. By 1944, deception had become as vital to victory as tanks or bombers. Both Axis and Allied planners understood that confusion could cripple an army faster than bullets. From the battlefields of France to the jungles of the Pacific, a new breed of warfare emerged, one fought not with firepower, but with illusion. And among its most ingenious inventions stood the paradummy, a lifeless figure that could turn chaos into opportunity and fear into a weapon. The story of deception from the skies didn't begin with the Allies, it began with the Germans, 4 years earlier, during the invasion of Belgium in May 1940. The target was Fort Eben-Emael, a massive fortress guarding the bridges across the Albert Canal, considered one of the strongest defenses in Europe. Before dawn, German gliders swooped silently out of the mist, carrying elite assault teams whose mission was to neutralize the fortress before Belgian troops could react. But alongside these gliders, another secret weapon descended: dummy paratroopers, the first of their kind used in combat. Colonel Rudolf Witzig, the young commander of the assault force, later recalled how several groups of uniformed dummies were dropped west of the canal. Their purpose was simple: to make the Belgians believe they were being surrounded. As the dummies hit the ground, Belgian soldiers opened fire, searchlights swept in every direction, and radio reports flooded the headquarters of paratroopers landing deep behind their lines. Confusion spread faster than the attack itself. Major Gerhard Schacht, another officer in the operation, confirmed that the decoy drop misdirected large portions of the 5th Belgian Division. While real glider troops stormed the fortress roof with shaped charges, Belgian commanders wasted precious hours redeploying units to chase phantoms. In the chaos, Fort Eben-Emael, thought to be impregnable, fell in less than 24 hours. That moment marked the birth of a new kind of warfare. For the first time, fabric and imagination had been turned into a weapon. The Germans had discovered that even a few dummies, falling through the dark, could split enemy focus and unravel defenses built over years. It was a small, almost theatrical trick, but one that would echo across future battlefields and inspire the great deceptions yet to come. By December 1944, the war had turned against Germany. Allied forces had landed in France, Paris was liberated, and Hitler's empire was collapsing from both east and west. But in one last desperate gamble, he ordered a massive counterattack through the thick forests of the Ardennes. A surprise offensive meant to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. To fuel the illusion of overwhelming power, German planners revived a trick from their earlier campaigns: dummy paratroopers. In the icy darkness north of Camp Elsenborn, transport planes roared through the night, dropping 300 dummy figures across the snow-covered hills. Each was dressed in a German uniform, weighted to fall like a real man, and meant to convince American patrols that hundreds of enemy paratroopers had landed behind their lines. Within hours, US units were reporting phantom movements, fires in the woods, footsteps in the snow, strange voices in broken English. The ruse worked. Troops were diverted, patrols were called, and confusion spread through already fragile lines. But while the deception caused short-term panic, the larger German plan crumbled under its own weight. Their real airborne operation failed, their tanks bogged down, and their supply lines were shattered. The Ardennes offensive would end in disaster for Hitler, yet the paradummy mission remained the one part of the operation that truly succeeded. It proved that even in the closing days of the war, when resources were running dry and morale was fading, Germany still believed that a few cloth soldiers falling from the night sky could change the course of a battle, if only for a moment. By the spring of 1944, the tide of war had fully turned. The Allies were preparing for the greatest invasion in history, Operation Overlord, the assault on Nazi-occupied France. Every detail had to be perfect, every movement masked by layers of deception. The British called this vast web of misinformation Operation Bodyguard, and within it lay a daring plan to fool the German high command from the skies. It was called Operation Titanic. The concept was simple, but brilliant. Instead of sending thousands of real paratroopers into heavily defended zones, the Allies would drop dummy soldiers nicknamed Ruperts to make the Germans believe that multiple airborne divisions were landing all across northern France. These cloth and rubber figures were only half the size of a man, yet designed to look convincing in descent. Some carried noisemakers that mimicked gunfire, while others were accompanied by SAS commandos who would land nearby to create chaos, cut telephone wires, and fire blank rounds to sell the illusion. On the night of June 5th, 1944, hours before D-Day began, Allied bombers took off under heavy cloud cover. As they reached their drop zones, hundreds of Ruperts tumbled from the sky, their parachutes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Operation Titanic, I simulated an entire airborne division landing north of the River Seine to draw German reserves away from Normandy. Titanic 2 and 3 dropped smaller groups of dummies near Cannes and the beaches to the west, while Titanic 4 unleashed over 200 decoys around Saint-Lô, supported by 2 real SAS teams. The effect was immediate. German commanders received frantic reports of parachute landings across half of France. Entire units were diverted to chase ghosts in the fields, while the real Allied divisions, the 101st and 82nd Airborne, secured key bridges and roads far from those false zones. In one night, the Allies had weaponized illusion on a scale never seen before. The skies of France became a stage, and the paradummies, silent, lifeless, and forgotten, played their role perfectly. The story of these ghostly soldiers didn't end in the skies over Normandy. Behind every dummy that floated down that night was a tale of craftsmanship, secrecy, and innovation that began years earlier, long before D-Day was even imagined. The first Allied paradummies were born not in a military factory, but in a small workshop in Ashland, Massachusetts, where an American inventor named George Friedman worked with his brother, Fred. In 1938, a British trade agent quietly approached them with a strange request: to design a small, lightweight figure that could pass as a paratrooper from a distance. The brothers agreed, and after months of testing fabrics, weights, and shapes, they produced a compact, half-size figure. They called him Rupert. Friedman's invention was simple, yet effective: a cloth body stuffed with straw and sand, with arms that flailed convincingly as it fell. During tests, it looked real enough to fool observers on the ground, and soon, British factories began producing thousands of Ruperts in secret. But George Friedman wasn't finished. He envisioned a more advanced version one that could inflate automatically in midair and even simulate battle sounds. His next design, the White Knight, was an inflatable dummy equipped with a self-destruct charge and a small firing simulator to mimic automatic gunfire. In 1943, the US Navy took an interest in Friedman's design and contracted him to produce 5,000 inflatable dummies for a top-secret project. By March 1944, his new creation, known as the Navy PD, Paratroop Decoy, PAC, was shipped to England. This version was far more sophisticated. When dropped from a plane, it would automatically inflate, emit rifle fire noises upon landing, and then detonate after a few minutes to prevent capture. Each dummy descended at about 20 feet per second from roughly 700 feet, creating the unmistakable illusion of a real paratrooper assault. These devices were more than decoys, they were psychological weapons. When scattered across dark skies, their parachutes catching moonlight and their rifle simulators echoing through the night, they convinced entire garrisons that enemy troops had arrived. In reality, they were nothing but air, fabric, and ingenuity. Yet their presence on the battlefield proved that imagination, when paired with deception, could be as deadly as any bullet. By the summer of 1944, the paradummy had become more than an experiment. It was a trusted tool of deception. After its success in Normandy, Allied planners used the tactic again during the invasion of southern France, codenamed Operation Dragoon. In the early hours of August 15th, as warships bombarded the French Riviera and paratroopers prepared to jump inland, 6 Allied aircraft flew ahead on a special mission. Their cargo wasn't men, it was 600 Navy PD packs. As the planes neared the coast, north and west of Toulon, the dummies were released into the night. Below, German radar screens lit up with phantom signals. Amplified by a blizzard of window, thin strips of tinfoil dropped to mimic the radar signature of massive air fleets. To the Germans, it looked like a full-scale airborne assault. Searchlights swept the sky, anti-aircraft guns thundered, and reserve units scrambled toward the false drop zones. The dummies landed, inflated on impact, crackled with simulated gunfire, and then self-destructed, leaving only smoldering fragments in the fields. By the time German commanders realized they had been tricked, the real Allied troops were already advancing along the Riviera. In one of the most successful feints of the war, a few hundred decoys had misdirected entire battalions. Even Axis Sally, the notorious German radio propagandist, bitterly mocked the trick, calling the devices the product of a fiendish Anglo-Saxon mind. But the paradummy's role didn't end in Europe. The Allies soon carried the tactic into the Pacific theater, where the terrain and vast distances offered fertile ground for deception. During the assault on Hollandia, New Guinea, in April 1944, hundreds of dummies were dropped to convince the Japanese that landings were taking place far from the real target. Similar decoy drops were used during the Philippines campaign in October 1944 and again in February 1945, when the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment conducted its operations in Luzon. In each case, dummy paratroopers created enough confusion to scatter enemy defenses and buy time for real troops to strike. Across 2 continents and 3 oceans, these lifeless figures served a living cause misdirection. They never fought, never bled, and never spoke, yet they helped silence guns and save lives. By the war's final year, the paradummy had proven itself not as a toy or a novelty, but as a strategic weapon, one that turned the human mind into the battlefield. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the era of deception did not end. The paradummy, now proven as one of the war's most effective psychological weapons, was far too valuable to be forgotten. In the years that followed, American engineers quietly began refining the idea under the guidance of the National Defense Research Committee and the Engineer Research and Development Laboratories. Their mission was simple: to take the crude wartime decoys and transform them into a reliable, reusable, and realistic diversionary system for future conflicts. The new project would soon be known by a codename, Oscar. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, engineers and paratroopers worked side by side, experimenting with different designs and materials. The prototypes were nothing more than windsock-shaped simulators, hollow tubes that inflated as they fell through the air. They were lightweight and cheap, but far too fragile, collapsing in midair or landing in twisted heaps. ERDL replaced them with new plastic film figures, reinforced with rings to mimic a human body and weighted with small iron pellets in the head, hands, and feet for stability. Each test brought improvements: more natural descent, better balance, and greater realism from the ground. But perfection came at a cost. The vinyl and cellulose materials stiffened in cold weather and stretched in the heat, making them unreliable in the field. Undeterred, the engineers began mixing cloth, plaster, and steel into hybrid models. By 1946, several new prototypes were ready, ranging from 3 feet to nearly 6 feet tall, weighing between 35 and 125 pounds. Each was equipped with a parachute sized for its weight and built to descend just like a real soldier. That March, Fort Bragg hosted a series of dramatic mass drop tests. Hundreds of dummies, small, medium, and full-size, tumbled from transport planes, their parachutes opening in synchronized bursts. Observers on the ground, even seasoned paratroopers, reported they couldn't tell which were real until they hit the ground. The 4-foot model was judged the most convincing. Light enough to deploy in numbers, yet heavy enough to fall with believable motion. By the early 1950s, the new Oscar had evolved into a complete airborne deception system, consisting of a lifelike dummy, a self-destructive mechanism to prevent capture, and a compact pack for rapid deployment. Field tests between 1950 and 1951 confirmed its effectiveness, earning high praise from the Army, which called it an excellent airborne diversionary simulator. In October 1955, the final report approved Oscar for service, officially integrating the paradummy concept into US military doctrine. By the time the Cold War dawned, Oscar had earned his place among the quiet tools of modern warfare. He remained listed in US Army field manuals until 1977, more than 3 decades after his first descent over Europe. Though his missions were rarely publicized, scattered reports hinted at limited use during the Korean War and even in Vietnam, where deception and misdirection often meant survival. For more than 30 years, the humble paradummy, born from cloth and imagination, continued to serve as a ghostly ally to the armies that mastered illusion. But beyond its technical evolution, the true power of the paradummy lay in what it represented. It was a symbol of how warfare had changed, not just a contest of strength, but of perception. The dummy paratroopers didn't fight or kill. They manipulated fear, disrupted communication, and exploited the single most fragile element of any army, the human mind. They turned confusion into a weapon, using nothing more than fabric, air, and belief. From the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the beaches of Normandy and the jungles of New Guinea, these silent figures played their invisible roles. Each one that drifted through the clouds carried with it a calculated lie that saved real soldiers' lives. Though they left no graves and no medals, their contribution was undeniable. In the great tapestry of World War II, the paradummies Ruperts, White Knights, and Oscars proved that sometimes the most effective soldiers are the ones who never existed at all.